The discussion tonight is on war in Ukraine and approach of socialists to that, what our approach should be. We have two speakers tonight, but welcome Will McMahon and Ed Potts. I hope everybody's had the opportunity to read the two excellent articles from Will and Ed, Not All Quiet on the Western Front and In Whose Interests. I'm going to give them 10 minutes each to introduce the discussion, and then I'll ask for contributions to be 3 minutes each so that we can get as many people speaking as possible. Of course, if we don't have so many people, then people will be able to come back in. No problem with that. And if there are questions, I will call Ed and Will in maybe halfway to answer direct questions, specific questions. And then I'll give them 5 to 6 minutes at the end to respond if they want to. Okay, so Will is going to go first, and I'll give you. Do you want me to let you know when it's 5 minutes, or shall I just tell you when your time's up?
Yeah, just give me a minute's warning, just in case I'm a bit slow. That's fine.
Okay, yeah. Great. Well, there you go.
Okay. Should I? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a long view of what's happening in Ukraine, and we'll end up with some short-term considerations. I think I'm going to start with Clausewitz, who everybody's quoting at the moment. He was a Prussian general who lived through the rise and fall of Napoleon. And he said that war is the continuation of policy by other means. And the reason I'm starting with him is because I think that pretty much sums up what's happening with the war in Ukraine. You know, while knowing who fired the first shot is important, it's not as important and not a substitute for understanding why the first shot was fired. And we need to understand what led to the war, and we need to know how the road to war unfolded over time. So my first point is that simply focusing on the fact of the Russian invasion has the effect of bleaching out all considerations. And those people who've argued in favor of the war, I think really, they keep saying Russia invaded Ukraine. That's all you need to know. It's not that complicated. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. So my long-range historical perspective starts from this, really. There's been a centuries-long struggle for the domination of Eastern Europe once Russia took control of a kind of a fully formed multinational empire, or a prison house of nations, as it came to be called, under the rule of Catherine the Great, who died just after the French Revolution. Now, that Russian state, as it was constituted, has experienced 4 very violent invasions, 3 in the 20th century. The Napoleonic War was the first. And then in the 20th century, we had the First World War, there was the Second World War, and lastly, there was the invasion of globalizing free market capitalism in the 1990s. Now, I add this last one to the list because it's really important that, you know, it's understood that it's not just tanks and missiles that kill people. In the early 1990s, 10 million people out of a population of 147 million, that's 1 in 15, died in a 5-year period. Their lives and communities were devastated as a result of the shock therapy introduced by the IMF and other international capitalist institutions. So that's like 4 to 5 million people dying in Britain over the last 5 years. It's a huge number. So it's not difficult to imagine how this might have impacted on everyone in Russia, and perhaps explain the rise of Vladimir Putin and a layer of the Russian ruling class who did not want to be further cannibalized by NATO and the IMF. This puts into context a second really important factor, that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO's affirmation of itself as a global fighting machine has appeared. And a statement of intent was the launch of Global NATO in 2006. This was confirming a strategy of ensuring US global domination in the face of what was then obviously a rising China and the re-emergence of the Russian state as an international player. It was confirming an inter-imperialist competition. NATO is now resident in over 85 countries, but the main point I want to make here is that the main enemy that NATO sees is not Russia, but China. This is the key reason why the war we are witnessing, for me, is an inter-imperialist war. So it's in this context that the events in Eastern Europe have to be viewed. NATO's noose has been tightened around Russia as NATO has expanded east. Between 1999 and 2004, 10 Eastern European countries joined NATO. Then the decision was taken at the 2008 Bucharest summit that the Ukraine would eventually become a NATO member. And in February 2019, the Ukrainian parliament voted to amend its constitution of the country, to state Ukraine's goal of joining NATO and the European Union. All of these matters, in my mind, set the conditions for war. Now, as the noose was tightening, the thought must have been going through the mind of the Russian ruling class in charge, there's something we must do about this. It's very much similar to the thought that went through the mind of the German general staff as the First World War approached, saying that we know a war's coming and we should strike now before our imperialist enemy becomes stronger. NATO's rearming and militarization of Ukraine has been developing apace. It was clear that NATO's further encirclement of Russia was underway. This is the primary context. The global issue is the primary context. Now, to be clear, none of this context means that the working class from whatever country should support the Russian invasion, which is totally unjustified from a working class point of view. On the other hand, just over a year ago, I think more than a year ago now, it was commonly held amongst socialists that NATO is an alliance of the most murderous imperialist nations to date. Over centuries, its leading members have colonized the world, committed genocide, killed tens of millions, established slavery in the Americas, looted nations' wealth, and destroyed ecologies across the globe. In the 20th century, its pursuits of markets and profits, its leading members fought decolonization movements and supported military dictatorships that tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of trade unionists. You can think of Indonesia, Chile, huge kind of slaughter of the working class in those countries. Now, for some reason, some people believe that NATO is a leopard that can change its spots. Political journeys to the right can often take decades, and we have seen comrades make that journey, but they've been recently completed in weeks by some who call for national defense of Ukraine. And what they're doing is they're opting to hear no evil, see no evil, or speak no evil about the alliance the Ukrainian government is, and its attacks on the left and the trade union movement, not to mention the attack on the Russian Orthodox Church, which is taking place right now, and the Russian language. So what NATO presents as a fight for self-determination is essentially a struggle for global hegemony through the amassing of regional subordinates, of which Ukraine is a prime target. So NATO's object is to defeat Russia in Ukraine, not a peaceful resolution of the crisis through negotiation, but a war that bleeds Russia dry, creates a Ukrainian vassal state with a neoliberal economy, and gives other regional powers, including the European Union, and in particular Germany, a lesson in realpolitik. Just as Putin used the civil war in Ukraine to weaken the Ukrainian state, so the United States is using the Ukrainian war to weaken the Russian state. It's essential to understand that NATO's march east will not stop at Moscow, which is basically a starter dish before Beijing, in my view. So this is not a question of agreeing with tanks or disagreeing with tanks or shells with depleted uranium or F-16. It's a question of bringing a halt to a march towards a third world war. Because the National Defense Socialists, who began the war by arguing that those who opposed the calls to arm Ukraine were apologists for Putin and his camp, now find themselves shoulder to shoulder with NATO in a campaign for the defeat of Russia, and objectively in the camp of NATO's imperialist war drive against China. Now, there is still time for people to change their course and for them to develop an independent working class perspective, but time for those socialists who've been backing this war is running short. Thank you.
Oh gosh, wow, that was with 1 minute 40 seconds to spare. You caught me out.
Wow.
Do you want to have them? Do you want to have
No,
them?
no, keep going. We're running late.
Thanks very much indeed. Ed, I'll move on to you. And do you want me to give you any warning, or are you fine? Just do your 10 minutes.
It's fine. I'll set a timer for myself, but thanks.
Brilliant. There you go.
So I want to broaden out slightly and in some ways develop what Will has set out there and talk about how and why so many people on the left get it so wrong on this war and of course other wars in history as well. I'd encourage obviously everyone to read the article that I wrote as well as Will's, but in brief summary for those who haven't read it, the argument, it goes like this. Firstly, that war isn't an aberration, it's an ongoing feature of the capitalist system. And it follows that it's not enough for us as socialists to take each war in isolation and work out who's in the right and who's in the wrong. We need to actually see the war itself as part of the ongoing system, capitalist system, that we want to do away with. It's not the business of socialists, I'd argue, to act as cheerleaders for small nations against big, who work out who fired the first shot and support the other party, all of that sort of thing. Second, the fact that Ukrainians are obviously defending themselves, again, does not mean that the war as a whole is about self-defense or national liberation, certainly not to the exclusion of all other factors. We actually need to consider carefully and analyze the whole situation, including the interplay of global forces and the demands of the capitalist economy, in order to understand what's going on and work out how we as a working class movement need to respond. Thirdly, Ukraine is and of course remains a capitalist state. The only war worth fighting for us, I would suggest, is the class war. The Ukrainian working class and the Ukrainian ruling class are on opposite sides in that class war. They're enemies. The pro-war socialists, of course, rely on appeals to human sympathy very successfully. But ironically, what they're doing by that is enjoining people to support the very war that it encourages and allows the human suffering to continue rather than putting an end to it. And what we need to fight for instead is for the end of war and the replacement of the system that produces war. So those are some of the arguments that I was advancing in the article. The article, of course, was framed as a response to a piece by John McDonnell, which appeared on the Labour Hub website, which argued for support for Ukraine in its war efforts, or more accurately, support for British government in its support of Ukraine. But the malaise affecting the left and the Labour movement, I would say, is much broader than a simple mistake made by this one MP. The official position of the Labour Party is uncompromising support for the British government and its provision of material, economic and military support to Ukraine. Overall, it's my assessment that the left, the hitherto anti-war left, has failed to resist this. The Socialist Campaign Group of MPs is split on this issue. John McDonnell, Clive Lewis, Nadia Whittome and others are supportive of the war effort. On the other side, perhaps Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, and maybe 10 others. Some of these Socialist Campaign Group MPs actually rescinded their support for a Stop the War Coalition statement on pain of losing the party whip because the statement was perceived as insufficiently critical of the Russian invasion. What about others on the left? Well, the Green Party, to quote from one of their statements, believes that Ukraine should be provided with the means for its self-defense, including battle tanks and other weapons. Momentum has been ambivalent on the issue, but has sent out so-called political education material, suggesting that Ukraine has a right to get the weapons necessary for its self-defense. People in the PCS union have gone so far as to support demonstrations outside the Foreign Office in London calling for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. Now, none of this should be unexpected for anyone who's read some of the history of the socialist movement in responding to war. Even at the notional high point of the socialist movement before the First World War, the official position of the socialist movement in 1907 was this: if war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives, supported by the coordinating activity of the International Socialist Bureau, to exert every effort in order to prevent the outbreak of war by the means they consider most effective, which naturally vary according to the sharpening of the class struggle and the sharpening of the general political situation. In case war should break out anyway, it is their duty to intervene in favour of its speedy termination, and with all their powers to utilise the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. So that was a resolution passed by the Socialist International in 1907. And of course, the contrast between that, perhaps the high point of the left's anti-war stance and the stance of some people on the left today couldn't be clearer. Of course, just 7 years later, with the outbreak of World War I, that position turned out to be as brittle as glass, and it was shattered, and our movement was shattered along with it. What we also need to bear in mind is that the ruling class also benefits from and is determined to foster a section of the ostensibly socialist or revolutionary left going over to the pro-war camp. How this is justified is relatively unimportant as long as they come to the right conclusion. In a more general sense, the pressure on the working class movement to support war, even a war in which our country is notionally not involved, is enormous. This is achieved by an overwhelming consensus within parliamentary politics, by undemocratic suppression of anti-war or war skeptic voices within the political parties, and most notably the Labour Party, and by unanimous support for the war across the press and broadcast media and so on. There will always be overwhelming insistence that this war, unlike all the others, is a just war. The ruling class may have lied to you about the last war and the war before that, but don't worry, you can definitely believe them this time. And it's into this trap that I think many people on the left who found themselves supporting the war aims of Ukraine and the war aims of the British and American governments, it's into that trap that they've fallen. The urge to do something, be seen to be doing something, and to pick a side rather than doing nothing it's a tremendous urge to do that, but it's ultimately very, very misguided. I think what this brings home is that without an independent press and an independent apparatus for the workers' movement to put forward its own politics and argue for its own politics, supplied with accurate information through channels of our own, it's no wonder that our class is vulnerable to the sort of manipulation that's put out very, very consistently, a barrage of information through the media, including, of course, atrocity propaganda, trying to stir up people's very natural and very commendable human sympathy for suffering in war in support of, ironically, the war effort, rather than trying to bring the war and the system that produces war to an end. In order for us to change the world, we need to confront the fact that we need access to reliable information, and we also need an organization and media apparatus of our own in order to put across that information and to establish genuine international links, which mean that we're no longer reliant on what the ruling class would like us to know about what's going on internationally in very difficult situations such as this. So the socialist movement has a choice. It can stand up for its principles, try to remain resolute in the face of overwhelming criticism against anybody who's even remotely skeptical of the war drive, try to stand against all of that, or as some have done, it can bow to the pressure and effectively act as the left wing of the bourgeois order, taking a view that it will support whichever warring nation has the better track record on human rights, whichever is the smaller nation out of two nations at war, whichever nation didn't fire the first shot, and so on and so on. In summary, I think the main thing to bear in mind is that our movement needs to constantly be on guard against opportunism and against a collapse into pro-war politics. We need to be constantly prepared to discuss and debate the realities and the principles at stake when it comes to war. And that's because the risk of a collapse into opportunism can never be ignored. It's never a settled question, precisely because the need of the capitalist class for war and the need of the capitalist class to discipline the ruling class into supporting its war drive will always be there. And if those material conditions are always there because the capitalist system survives, then we always need to reckon with them. We always need to be prepared to make the arguments anew and to deal with the reasons that people fall into opportunism and assume that we can push back against that and advance a pro-working class politics, which is anti-war and against the capitalist system as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I invite any questions or contributions. If people can either physically put their hand up or use the reaction button and put a hand up that way, just let me know and then I'll call you in as I see you. It seems very much that the sort of facile debate that I've seen on our left, in inverted commas, constituency group is down to if you raise any criticism or point out that this is a capitalist war, then it's so you support Putin, and that there seems to be no consideration of the working class in Russia, who both protested against the war and in fact who've been forced to participate physically and lose their lives. Okay, so in order of how I saw them coming on the screen, I've got Minnie. I'll time 3 minutes. Okay, fire away. You've muted yourself again, Minnie. Minnie?
Hello, can you hear? Right,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I think
go.
thank you. And I've read both the articles and I agree with them. I just wanted to put a few points in. One was about the climate, the methane that's been introduced into the atmosphere from the blowing up of the pipeline by Seymour Hersh said it was the Americans with the help of the Swedish, was it, and Norwegians. Also wanted to say that the use of depleted uranium, that this country, I'm not going to use the term we because it certainly isn't me or Graham here, is sending over to Ukraine for them to fight. The NATO used it in Kosovo too, and there's been an increase in leukemia, but they didn't use it in as much as they did in Fallujah. Also to say that the Abby Martin, who's an activist, an American activist, she's very, very good. She's making a documentary on the military-industrial complex, military around the world and climate change, specifically the US military. I'm looking forward to watching that. Yeah. I wrote an article about the climatic effects of the US military and militaries around the world. They don't have to declare how much how much oil or whatever, how much they're contributing to climate change. They don't have to. In the is it the Kyoto Protocol? They didn't have to, and then they didn't have to do it in the one that was after that. Also, as I think Soraya was just saying, I put a motion once to the, I'm going to run out of time, I just know I am, to our CLP in Liverpool, and it was against the Tory increase in spending. They'd already increased it in the 2019 election. It was going up by 24 billion. I was advocating change to production for need, useful work, green energy, a transition. Look at what happened with the Lucas plan, etc., to be against the increase in the arms, etc. And the centrists, the faux left or soft left or whatever some people call them, they took it down. They called it naive. They lied about what the motion was. they'd read it. Yes, of course they'd read it. They misrepresented it. So that's what we're up against. I totally agree that as a working class, we are not into war because we are in the firing line at the moment with the fight going on in Ukraine. In what's the name of that town? I can't remember where it is at the moment, the city or town it is at the moment. It's absolute carnage. I think the Russians are close to winning. And apparently, if they do, that's going to open up the whole of Ukraine. Am I done? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Paul, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I get what Will is saying in his article, that that the background information couldn't be used to justify the invasion, but that's my real problem. If you take all those events and then come to where we are now, it's not really an invasion, it's actually a defensive situation. When you compare all those material forces building up all around those territories, I don't actually see it as an invasion as such. I see it as a defensive operation. Another thing that I will say, I've often come across many people, quite a few people on the left, I think will describe them as national defense socialists. They're the ones that rally behind Ukraine. And then they talk about the language getting behind the working class, but really they're actually supporting the NATO expansion and therefore US imperialism. Those very same people also accuse Russia and China of being imperialist. Again, I don't agree. They're not socialists, don't get me wrong, but in my mind, I don't know if this makes sense, but it is possible to still have capitalist property relations and mode of productions without actually being imperialist. And I think that's what Russia and China currently are. What I mean by that, they're not actually going around the world expanding their territories and exploiting their natural resources. Russia and China's relations with other countries tend to be much more based on trade, whereas the US prefers to cripple people by debt and so on. China and Russia do not do that in those terms. So in that sense, I don't accept that Russia and China is imperialist. And if Russia wins this,
you can just wind up, please.
Sorry?
Could you just wind up? You've had 3 minutes.
If Russia wins, well, win probably the wrong word, but if it pushes back against NATO, that's the war against China gone for a Burton. And with all these other trading deals currently going on with China, Russia and so on, that provides an opportunity to end the US hegemony, but also allows the working class forces within those other countries, joining unions, etc., to fight against their own ruling classes in those particular countries. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks a lot. Okay, Anita, is it your hand that's up? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Great, yeah, it's my hand, yeah. The first thing I wanted to say is more of a question, actually, about, NATO is not actually having its own way all the way on this, on the Ukraine war, they are actually quite vulnerable in lots of ways. And one of the things that came up recently, which I thought was really interesting, is a study that was done by European Council on Foreign Relations. I think it's a kind of, pro-war, pro-NATO body that's been set up by the EU. And they did a study recently about the views on the Ukraine war in the global South. And I think it's quite dangerous actually for them, because it feels like the global South predominantly is actually opposed to the war and actually can see, quite clearly what the Americans are doing, having suffered from, the kind of American imperialism as they have over the decades. And then the global South is actually, about 80% of the world's population. So, we're looking at not NATO having not its own way all the way through. So I just wondered if either of the speakers had kind of, looked into that a little bit and thought about what it means sort of, worldwide. Actually what it means for us as building an anti-war movement in this country, in terms of how the Black population and the people around them, how they view the war as well, and what the potential of mobilizing them against the war is as well. And the second thing I actually wanted to say is, it feels as if there was also an element of NATO, or possibly Johnson even, wanting to kind of escalate things as the strikes in Britain were, taking off, and Mick Lynch was on television talking about the class. And I felt as if at one point, there was a sort of necessity to kind of, really ramp up the issue of the war, which obviously, is the case that they want to do that. I don't know if anybody had thought about that bit as well. In terms of our own movement, I think in some sense there is some clarity. War is providing this clarity, like Bernie Sanders and the squad voting to send that kind of money to, going behind Biden on the war issue. On the heels of, very quickly on the heels of voting to impose effectively a no-strike contract on striking rail workers. The two things are linked, obviously, So there's a clarity here, which I think for us as socialists, we have to grab with both hands and say, right, these people are no longer part of the left. They have, and their support for the war is actually an attack on the class, So anyway, that's my contribution for this for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jerry, you've got your hand up. Unmute, yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, you just caught me making a cup of coffee.
Sorry.
First of all, my apologies for my lateness. It wasn't intentional, so I would just like to apologise for that. It's quite rude, and yeah.
Don't worry,
okay, so for me, the war has been in Ukraine has been very difficult actually, because it would appear to me that obviously we're being told what to say by the authorities in the West, and clearly it's not what's happening. I almost entirely agree with Paul Collins. I believe that, and at the end of the day, we can only believe what we can, because we don't have all the information, and there's a lot of conflicting information. But I do believe that and I'm sorry for missing the earlier part, but it seems to me that the Ukrainians have been killing their people, killing Russians, and in those circumstances, being against war, I still feel that perhaps the Russians should have invaded. So I'm interested to know the views of people in this respect. What should the Russians have done? What should have been done about the clearly right-wing Nazi Ukrainian government and its people attacking people in Donbass? Should the Russians have sat back and allowed that to happen? Should the Russians have sat back and allowed NATO people to become Ukraine to become part of NATO? There are clearly lots of issues going on, and I feel that this has been largely pushed by the Americans, and I'm interested to know what people think should have happened, because the only people that really suffer in war are the working classes, and you know, they're the people that die and become homeless and such alike. But what else is there to do when you have an imperialist like America attacking people within Ukraine? Clearly, part of the reason for that happening, and so on. Knowing that your borders, you're going to have American missiles on your borders if you don't do something as well. I'm interested in what people, because I'm against war, but at the same time, I can see, I feel that there's reasons for the Russians going into it, and I'm really interested to know what people think. And I don't believe the Ukrainians will win the war, and I think Zelensky has to be very careful, because he'll probably get bumped off by the Americans when they feel they don't want him anymore.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now I've got, we've had a few questions. I can see Paul put his hand up again, and nobody else has, but looking at the time, I think I might just bring Will and Ed in to, oh, sorry, I've seen Nick's hand. Okay, and I've seen Gary's hand, right, okay, that's shut me up. Nick, and then Gary. Okay, fire away.
Well, I was just going to try to answer Jerry's point in terms of what should we have told the Russians to do, and from my point of view, that's the wrong question. I mean, it's Jerry's question, so I'll deal with it. But it's not our role as socialists, it seems to me, to be giving advice to the ruling capitalist class, the oligarchs in Russia, what they should do to defend their class and their interests, just like it's not our role as socialists to give advice to Biden and the leaders of NATO as to what they should do. Because I share the approach that's been taken by Will and Ed, and I think the way to approach this is to try to see what are the interests that have motivated the parties to war, and what does the working class have to say, or should it say, in response. And I start with that same quote that Will used from Clausewitz, and we see that there is a challenge to US hegemony in terms of the world order, with the rising power of China, which in my opinion is a capitalist state, a capitalist class, and it's challenging the rule of American imperialism. And American imperialism is trying to combat that and weaken China, and it's sought to do that, first of all, by breaking capitalist Russia. And so capitalism is an order which is based on competition, economic competition, and that breaks out from time to time into physical competition, into war. And the argument that I think that socialists should say, both in Russia, in Ukraine, in America, in Britain, in Germany, everywhere, is to say, we cannot support either side in this war. You are prosecuting this war in your own interests. It doesn't matter who made the first blow or whether Putin saw the need to do something defensively, because we see that Putin has locked up his opponents who oppose the war. He's clamped down on protest, and he's just as vicious, if not more so, in terms of the absence of democratic rights and so on, than we have in the capitalist West. So we should give no support to either. Is that my 3 minutes?
It is. Thanks. Gary. Can't hear you. Technical problem, I think.
We are. Right.
Okay, great, got you.
Yeah, fantastic. Sorry, I lost my person. So really good introductions, actually. I thought Will did a really good job of explaining, analysing the context and the sort of dynamics of what led up to this particular war. And I was really pleased that Ed started looking at the response of the left and different parts of the left in this country to the war. And that's what I wanted to have a quick look at. And I don't have any great answers, but I have to say that I think that the response of the left has been lame. Clearly, one of the problems has been, as always happens, that not just big chunks of the labourist and reformist left back the war, but also surprising sections of people who consider themselves to be revolutionaries and Marxists have backed the war as well. And that's been really shocking. But what hasn't happened is a concerted, active, and very visible campaign against the war. And I guess we have to start there by looking at the Stop the War campaign. And it's worth reflecting on why the Stop the War campaign hasn't managed to shape and mobilize an active voice against the war. I mean, I think that, and in a sense, there's an element of the microcosm of the problems that we face on the left in general here, and with labourism in general. So I think that Stop the War have been surprisingly sheepish in calling out the cowardice and the betrayal of the Socialist campaign group, similarly of forces like Momentum. And I think that there is a far too cozy relationship between some on the anti-war left and the campaign group, and in particular, I have to say also Corbyn, although of course Corbyn has been taking a principled stand against this. This is the one thing that we can rely on Corbyn to always take a principled stand on, to his credit. But it feels like there's a bit the Stop the War has been reticent and coy to call out the rest of his comrades, and partly out of loyalty to him for some reason. I think that there's also, of course, we have to look at the lack of democracy around Stop the War, and the lack of local grassroots and democratic organizations of branches that could build an anti-war campaign. And I think this is quite a big challenge for us. I'm not sure how we go about doing it, but it warrants consideration, I think. So that's more like throwing up a question more than actually saying this is what I think we should do. But it does feel like it's a big problem for us. But the other thing I wanted to quickly say, Soraya, is that somebody was talking about how they didn't feel that China and Russia were imperialist powers. I do strongly disagree with that. I think that Russia is a failing imperialist power that wants to revive its imperialist interests. I think China is an astonishingly effective imperialist power that at the moment is
Gareth, can you wind up?
Conquering the world through economic investment and control and influence, and at any point in time that could become a more overtly military domination. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Janet, I could see your cat lifting his or her tail during Gary's contribution, but was your hand up earlier?
No, I've got a headache, so I was
okay
doing that.
okay.
I mean, I'll say just one thing actually, about the Labour so-called left. I think from what it was a bit late, I think what Ed was saying about the certain MPs, it seems to me a few of those are actually very allied with the AWL, and that's why they're taking that stance. Certainly Nadia Whittome and Clive Lewis, who's my MP, who is being extremely aggressive and actually has taken the same stance as the AWL on anti-Semitism, which is why, well, I left the Labour Party a long time ago, but as a Jew, I was very angry with him. And I'm not sure about McDonnell. I think he has certain connections there as well, but I don't know about that. I think the other sort of campaign group are just cowards, basically, or thick. But I think in terms of two or three of them, it's actually ideological. That's all.
Thank you very much. That's great. So I was going to say, now I can see Paul's hand is still up, but I was wondering if Will and or Ed wanted to come back on the specific questions about Russia and China, imperialist, Anita's question on NATO. Would you like to?
I could, yeah, I could certainly respond to a few things, and maybe Will can take the more difficult ones.
Okay.
So
yeah. So if I give you 2 minutes, it's 2 minutes, 2 minutes each, and then others that will probably stimulate. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Sure. So, comrade, sorry, I didn't note down who was asking questions, so apologies. But a comrade referred to Bernie Sanders falling in behind Biden on this issue, and I think that that's quite instructive in a general sense, but also specifically in the case of Sanders, because first of all, his track record of supporting wars has been very mixed, to say the least. He was, of course, against the Iraq War, but in favor of various other military interventions, including in Yugoslavia. But also, what I think raises an interesting point is that while he voted against the invasion of Iraq, he voted for the disastrous and catastrophic program of sanctions against Iraq, which killed perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. I don't have an estimate to hand, but I'm pretty confident it was of that order. And to think back to Clausewitz, war is a continuation of politics by other means. I think we do also need to bear in mind as well that, in a way, peace is a continuation of war by other means. And I think that that's also very important when people are considering what the response of socialists should be to war, is that sanctions are warfare. They are warfare. They kill people as much as the provision of guns and bombs does. The Stop the War coalition, I think, is an interesting thing to develop because, of course, it started out very broad in terms of the range of people it could rely on for support, including people on the sort of liberal left. But of course, now, because of its position in this war, it's shrunk numerically in terms of its base of support. But what it hasn't done through that shrinking is that it hasn't achieved any perhaps greater clarity on why it is that war should be opposed, for what purpose we oppose war. Of course, it's completely legitimate to oppose war simply on the basis that it causes human suffering, and particularly human suffering to our class, as a comrade identified. But of course, there's something else as well, which is that war serves a particular purpose for the capitalist class, and socialists have a particular motivation to undermine war and to act against war, and also to turn war to our own ends and to respond to it in a way which furthers the struggle of our class for political power. And so I think that that's really important as well, because that's an argument that you won't hear the Stop the War coalition making, even though there are many socialists, even revolutionary socialists, who are very active in its core leadership. Perhaps if I leave it there and we can respond to other stuff.
Okay. Will, do you want 2 minutes?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Anita asked a good question about the kind of Western minority, actually. There's no question about that. I mean, the German president turned up in Brazil the other day to ask for Lula's support for the war in Ukraine, and Lula basically said no. That ain't happening. You have the same with South Africa. You have a huge ambiguity around India and their position, and Pakistan, actually, the position that there was being held there. So I'm pretty convinced that basically the United States, as Nick was pointing out, is fighting a rearguard action against a changing imperialist order. And the Chinese in particular have been extremely effective at building alliances across the global south, down to the fact that now they've started using the Chinese currency as trading currency rather than using the dollar. This is really, really important, and the ideology of a multipolar world coming out of Russia and China is also really, really important. Not something I think we should go along with. Okay, we want international working class solidarity. Yeah. So I think that's a really important point. I think that I think China went through a process of state-centered accumulation and transformed itself into a capitalist nation. And I agree that it is a brilliant imperialist country in its own terms, because it almost hasn't had to fire a shot. Yeah, which is incredibly threatening to the United States, really. One or two other points very quickly. I think Minnie's point about climate and, thinking about how else we could use the skills of workers that are being used now to produce weapons to murder working class people is a really important thing. And the Lucas aerospace plan is quite old, but we need to return to that subject. There's no doubt about that. And the final point I would make is that there is a triangle of Corbyn's campaign to be able to stand, however he does it, the Ukraine war in opposition to it, and the class struggle, that if we can build that triangle, we can make space for revolutionary politics. And we have to try and connect those three things together.
Thank you very much. Okay, so it's nearly past. We have to finish at 9. Paul has had his hand up for a while, but I'm just, could people indicate who else would like to come back in or come in for the first time, so that I can sort of allocate whether I can be more generous with time? Or okay, so I've got 3 hands up. Any more for any more? Okay, so I think you can have, my maths is always awful, but yeah, I can get 4 hands up. Okay, let's go for 3 minutes again each. Okay, so Paul, you were first. Fire away. Can't hear you, Paul. Paul. Yep. No, still can't hear you. Something weird's going on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call Minnie in again and see if you can sort out your sound, okay? Minnie.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, thank you. Just wanted to say Abby Martin also revealed that US commanders in the Afghanistan war, they also sit on the boards of US weapons companies, and they lied to keep the war going for 20 years. Also wanted to say that we're in a very, very dangerous situation. Obviously, this could lead to nuclear war. I know the Russians, I was listening to a military expert last night. Obviously, with the media, who do we trust to tell us what's really going on in this war as well? Lots of games being played, but it's carnage. War is not a game. The Russians, I think, have got 60,000, is it troops, 60, 70,000 troops on the border. Ukrainians are dying en masse. There's not many more troops to put in, or volunteers, reservists, whatever. I think, I'm not sure whether the Ukrainians have a choice to fight in this war or not. I think they may be conscripted, and there's some videos online, you don't know what's fake these days, of them being literally taken off the streets and made to fight in the war. But I don't know whether that's true or not. There's fake videos going around. The Russians have missiles, apparently, that can avoid even US detection. I think the US missile warning system is facing one way, but the Russians now have missiles, and I've forgotten what they're called, that can go around the other way and come around the back of the US, and they can change their position in flight. They can move them around, and that the US wouldn't even necessarily know, or the West, when they were being hit. Not that I think anyone should press a nuclear button in reaction anyway. I can't stand nuclear weapons. What else? Oh, the cost of living, of course. The cost of living, the working class in this country is being made to pay with our energy bills. You know, for February, for example, our energy bill was, we used we'd halved our kilowatt hours compared to February last year. Compare them yesterday. We had to be cold for that, quite cold, but we got through it. We paid more for that. So the working class is being made to pay in so many different ways. It's useful to the ruling class war. It really is useful. And look how it's dividing everyone. I don't want war. I want peace, but I want reality. I want to get rid of the ruling class, and in every country,
Thanks
everyone
very
should
much.
get rid of their ruling
Thanks,
class.
Nick. Okay, Paul, have you sorted out your sound? Paul?
I think so.
Yep, great. Got you.
Yeah.
Yep, fire away.
I just wanted to go on from what Gary and then Nick said earlier on. Gary was basically asking, you know, what was Russia meant to do? And that's the way that I tend to see this. You know, in the Donbass and, you know, for instance, Putin just didn't suddenly go in. People within Russia, the parliamentary system in Russia was calling for him to sort of go in for around 8 years before he actually did go in. And of course, he didn't want to actually go in because he was well aware what would happen if they did sort of go into parts of Ukraine and take on the US and NATO forces. With regards to political prisoners and so on, I'm not sure how much of what said about what happened with regard to Russia, but what we do know is that Zelensky banned all left-wing parties in Ukraine when they kicked off. With regards to conscription, many wrote there was, I think Zelensky did actually impose conscription at some point for people up to a certain age. That was why Zelensky banned people from leaving Ukraine up to a certain age, because so that he could introduce conscription. Anyway, I stopped there. But as regard to stop the war, I think the problem with them is, obviously I have a vested interest because I'm a member of No to NATO, No to War. But the problem with them, in my personal view, is that on the one hand, they acknowledge the forces of the US and NATO, but ultimately they condemn Russia for the invasion, as some here have done tonight, completely ignoring the material reality on the ground. You need, you know, and also I agree with Janet's analysis of the so-called group of Labour MPs. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I know Jerry and Nick, you've been waiting, but Steve, who hasn't spoken, has asked to speak. So I'm going to call Steve in. Unmute yourself, Steve.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I usually use a laptop. I thought it a wise idea to use the iPad and don't know where anything is. But anyway, thank you very much. Excellent discussion. Two good lead-offs, and I think it's been a high-level discussion. I just want to make two really quite sort of points. I think it's really important. It's really good to see some international working class analysis of where we're at here. I've read both articles, but I think it's really important because I think what's really come out of this discussion this evening, but really emphasizes it for everybody, is the sort of myriad of different groupings and MPs and different left types that are all around us, all pulling us in different directions. Be it there are the pro-Putin types, but there are the armed Ukrainians, which is has been outlined here, a ludicrous scenario for all the reasons. But the one reason I wanted to point out is this isn't a fully fledged democratic government, even in a capitalist sense. This is a government that has banned its own trade unions, that has arrested politicians. And I think it was Will who hinted at it. if we'd have gone back before the war, these same types that are now calling on the arming of the Ukraine would have been the first ones to say that it's not a democratic country and we need to start fighting for a more democratic Ukraine. But I think the main point I just want to make, and I think it's really need to emphasize, is how does this end? I mean, it's very difficult to look at it. You think, oh, you know, nuclear war and, you know, war in the South China Sea. But ultimately, I think we have to have confidence in our class. We have to have confidence in history. And, you know, the Russian working class stopped the First World War, right? And then the sailors, the German sailors in 1918 put a final nail in the coffin. So however bleak it is, with the amount of people that we've got on the Zoom call, we are meeting, we are having a Zoom call, we are having an internationalist position. How many people signed the Declaration of Zimmerwald? I think there was about 20. So we just need to keep them, you know, this is maybe a first meeting, but we need to maintain an independent working class position and keep shouting it from the rooftops whenever opportunity that we get, whatever outlet we get for it, because it is the only defense against, which I think Ed pointed out really well, is capitalist powers. You know, they're pushing in only one direction, and it is only going to end in, well, you know, potentially with the kind of weapons that we've got these days, it can end in the, you know, destruction not just of human life but of the whole of the planet. So if we don't speak up, we have a responsibility too. But you know, we have history here where wars can be stopped by our class, and we need to keep shouting that from the rooftops. But very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Nick.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Chair. Steve made some really excellent points there, in my opinion, because it can seem to be bleak when the positions that we're putting are a minority. But it seems to me that the capitulation of the left to the position of the ruling class and backing the ruling class of America and NATO, it is really a capitulation or an indication of its complete lack of faith in the working class and its ability to change society. We have to find a way of getting our ideas of international working class solidarity and opposition to the capitalist system and the inevitable wars that ensue from it. We need to find a way of getting those ideas across in the labour movement here in Britain and internationally. It would be great if this video found its way into the homes of people in Ukraine and in Russia, because pretty much to a man and a woman, the left in Britain has followed the position of arm the Ukraine, which actually means all power to NATO, all power to the US, support for the increase in arms spending. And this was reflected actually at the TUC last year, when a resolution, I think it was moved by the GMB and backed by Unite, calling for an increased proportion of GDP to be spent on military production, was passed. And you see really the complete subordination of the narrow trade union interest, because these unions have got workers in the military industry, putting that above the interests of the working class in Britain and internationally. And we have to find a way of fighting against these arguments inside the labour movement. I just want to finish very briefly. I agree with Will's analysis and what Gary said about China and Russia are being imperialist powers, and it's a battle between imperialisms. I'm of the opinion that we don't take sides in that. However small our voice, we need to maintain a consistent, independent working class voice. I don't see how we can defend the invasion. We can explain it from the point of view of military tactics, strategy, but we can't defend it, because it's a reactionary move by a reactionary Putin led government, just as the encirclement of Ukraine by NATO is a reactionary process in the interest of reactionary capitalist countries. We have to try and look at what's in the interest of the working class, and this war is not. Some wars have been and could be, but this war is not a war that has any benefit for the working class in either side, in any country, for the reasons that Minnie has pointed out. We're now paying for the war, and we have to oppose it. Thank you
very much. Jerry.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, yeah, I coming on from what was just said, in talking about Russia myself, I'm talking about the explanation of the reason which Russia have gone in. I don't support the war. I support peace. But we have to be practical and look at why it's happened. And it's quite clear that the Americans are to blame for this. And we need to voice that. I think we need to get that message out there. I don't think. I think Will. I got the impression Will was saying, because I didn't quite catch on that. Will was saying that we should fight as part of a trilateral movement to keep Jeremy in the Labour Party. I don't. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I'm wrong, perhaps. Okay. Well, I will say I don't think that's going to happen. I think Jeremy will continue to fight until the last minute to remain in the Labour Party, and so he should, because that is the strategic thing to do, and of course I know that he wants to anyway. But it's clearly the Labour Party is part of the problem. The Labour Party is one of the real reasons why Stop the War and people around Stop the War have been silenced. And quite frankly, we need to move away from the Labour Party and start forming our own movements and getting people behind another way of doing things. Because the Labour Party is not going to do it for us, and it's causing the problems that we have now with a government which does what it likes because it knows that the next people to come into power, if it's not them, will just carry on what they're doing. So. And with the bills, with the energy rises, this is all part, as was said, it's all part of the strategy of war, which is to support the ruling classes and make the working classes pay. And all of this is unnecessary. As you said, the war is unnecessary, but the war goes back to stopping America from forcing the issue, stopping the Ukrainians from bombing the Russians in Donbass. That's all part and parcel of the capitalist movement to cause these issues, cause these problems, and put false prices up. So I'd like to see a move away from the Labour Party in order to help to stop this and allow Stop the War and people around Stop the War to be able to have a real say and get across what they want to say about stopping the war. They won't be able to do it when they got their hands tied by Keir Starmer. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that sort of is a segue into our discussion next time. So I'm going to ask Will and Ed to come back. If you can do that. We've actually got, well, you can have 3 minutes each, maybe.
Okay. Should I go first and you finish, Ed? Is that
Yeah.
all right? The other way around?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I think a number of things after that conversation. It was really interesting. I think, how does it end? I think you're right to put your finger on it that actually the working class can end this war. And thinking about what was said about the global South, we just have to remember we're a minority in Western Europe and North America, but actually we're probably a majority in the global South. And we have to kind of watch and organize with people across the global South in order to stop this this war. That's what we have to do. So in a sense, I think the balance of forces are against the United States. I think it's right. There's a big problem that they've got here. Both the United States and Russia are involved in very high risk strategy here. And I think it is possible that the United States could be defeated and NATO could be defeated on this war. So I think that's the important first thing to say. Second thing to say is the people that should be worried are the pro-war, or you can call them social patriots or national defense socialists, who are backing this war at the moment, because they are riding a tiger. Yeah, their first tiger they're riding is NATO. The second tiger they're riding is Zelensky, who is an anti-working class neoliberal who is attacking the working class in Ukraine. What alliance you can have with that person, I don't know. The third tiger they're riding is the far right in Ukraine, because wars can be engines of revolutionary change. And unfortunately, it doesn't always have to be revolutionary change to the left. This is the real danger of what's going on in Ukraine, is that the far right is building out of this situation, right? And I don't want to start thinking about Nazis or whatever. It's just a far right nationalist, clearly Nazi fascist elements in it. And that is really dangerous. And it's really dangerous for the working class in Ukraine. And it's really dangerous for the working class across Central and Western Europe. There's no doubt about that. And they need to desist this backing of this imperialist war, because they're going to find themselves in a very difficult position. I don't think the Russian parliament, thinking about what Paul, the Russian parliament is pretty much stitched up parliament. Anybody who's been watching what's going on in Russia over the last 10 years knows that Putin has been closing down opposition all around. And we should have no doubts about that, actually. And it's a sort of democracy in a very loose sense of the term. And so we need to be careful about what we're saying about that. And this, I mean, we were talking about, somebody brought the issue up of Bakhmut, right? Bakhmut is about to fall, yeah? Tens of thousands of people, working class people, have died fighting over a town that has about 15,000, or did have about 15,000 people in it, yeah? I'm going to be agog to see how the Western media tie this one up and explain that actually the war's going very well. It's going to get more and more difficult for them, and I don't think they can do it. So we need to watch out for that. But the point I was making about Corbyn wasn't that I think he should stay in the Labour Party or leave the Labour Party. I think a kind of a political defence of Corbyn across the country being able to stand, whether he stands as a Labour candidate or whether he stands as an independent, is really important. Connecting that movement up to the anti-war movement such as it exists in its many different forms, and connecting those two things in a triangle with the class struggle, because people have pointed out how the class in this country has been impacted by the war. If we can get that connection and build something around that, then we might be able to build a growing resistance to capital, both at home and abroad. And I think that's what we should be doing. I'll finish there.
Thanks very much. Ed.
Yeah, well, I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you everybody for your contributions. I think the closing point that I think is probably one of the most central ones for me to draw out is that war necessarily entails the repression of the working class movement. And it entails that for two related reasons. First of all, repression of the working class's living standards in order to make the working class work harder for longer hours in order to feed the war machine and to feed the war economy. And so that obviously is obviously happening in Ukraine right now. And the attacks on living conditions and on trade union bargaining rights, which are excused by some people in the Ukraine Solidarity campaign and people in that sort of camp, are exactly what you would expect in any war. It's always the working class who pay the price for this war and for all other wars as well. And the capitalist class needs to do that in order to preserve the profitability of its system. But also, and related to that, it means repression of the working class movement as a force in its own right, which is able to advance its own politics and speak for itself and act independently of the ruling class. And that's because once the capitalist class has embarked on a war, it cannot tolerate any dissent which might undermine its war effort and risk either losing the war or dragging out the war and making it less profitable for the capitalist class. And so I think in a very real sense, this shows us how the working class, the interests of the working class in Ukraine and in Russia, and indeed in countries which are peripherally involved in this war, like Britain and like other Western countries, are essentially common interests. And that's what we have to bear in mind, because it's the repression and the narrowing of the scope of our movement for independent action, which is really going to be one of the key features of the war drive. And that's why, even though the UK is notionally not involved in the war, is not a party to this war, we have the absurd position where the Labour Party, which tolerates a very broad range of political positions on all kinds of issues, threatens to suspend MPs which take an insufficiently supportive approach to the government's war effort. So far from a situation where we're posing abstractions, as some people would accuse us of, talking about socialism instead of the concrete reality of the war here and now. Who do you support? What do socialists do? What do people in Ukraine do when their home is being attacked? Actually, we need to be confident and advance the argument that only socialist change, only an independent working class movement advancing socialist politics and capable of acting for itself in our own interests and capable of stopping the war, that is the only realistic policy which can actually do something about the war, when all the ruling class can offer us is more slaughter, more impoverishment, and so on.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. That was a really great discussion. Julie Furlong had to go, unfortunately, at about 8:30. She posted, I only saw it recently, but she thanked everybody for the discussion. I think you can see that in the chat. So thanks everybody who spoke, Ed and Will, and thanks everybody else for their contributions. We've got, as you no doubt know, we have a series of fortnightly meetings. The next meeting is what socialists do now after Corbyn, after the fact that Corbyn's been banned from standing as a Labour Party candidate. We'll see what happens with that. But the question for us, what should we be doing now to build a socialist alternative in those circumstances? And so I would invite everybody to participate in that meeting in a fortnight, and to encourage others that you know, other comrades you know, to join in as well, because obviously that's the aim, to grow and to spread the word, as it were. Are there any notices or anything, any notes that Will or Nick you need to?
If people didn't see the first part of the discussion about Corbyn, then you can see it on Facebook Live. There's the meeting is there, I think, on Nick's page. So that was quite a good discussion, and the next discussion is building upon that, because the situation has changed quite a lot.
Could I just say that we'll definitely have sorted out the technical issues for the next time, but the discussion is the one that all of the left in Britain are talking about, and Jerry's touched on it in his contribution. So please advertise the meeting and get people to come and give their tuppence worth, so that we really need to talk seriously about what we are going to do and how we can build a genuinely socialist movement. And that meeting is a contribution to it.
Jerry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, would you mind me saying that in that respect, I am part of a group which you may or may not know of now, called ORCISA, Organised Corbyn-Inspired Socialist Alliance. If you go onto Facebook, we've now got a website up. We got about 4.5, almost 5,000 members now within 6 weeks. We're looking to stand a candidate against Keir Starmer. The reason for this There are a number of reasons. So it's obviously Keir Starmer
Sorry,
is very
this is,
dangerous.
I thought you were going to say something about the meeting. You can bring that into, it's just because we've got, short
Yeah.
period of time left.
Can I just say,
You
get
can
onto the website, have a look, get on the Facebook.
Okay, fine. All right.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
Next
Thank
meeting,
you, everyone.
bring it to the next meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I was about to say, bring it to the next meeting. Hopefully we will have no technical problems next time. And actually we've got a minute left.
I
Anything?
just say to Jerry that we'll try to chat after the meeting between now and the next one. We'll have a bit of a chat.
Yes, please. And
Brilliant.
thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Can I
Thank
just say excellent meeting, and Soraya, thanks for chairing. Excellent meeting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Soraya.
So sorry for being so rigid with the timing, but it's just to try and get everybody in. The more we hear from each other, the better. I think we can all learn from each other, and yeah, hopefully there'll be more, and so there'll be shorter time because there'll be more people wanting to speak next time. But anyway, okay, well that's coming up for 9 o'clock. I know we've got to finish then, so thank you everybody. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
And we'll keep in touch in the meantime. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Raya. Thanks for sharing.
Bye.